coming today. I want to tell you up front, this is not a sermon, so I don't expect any amens. Don't walk out saying it was dry. He wasn't very interesting. When I taught at Kent State University with 80 students, I used to start off the first day of class asking them how many liked history. And it got so depressing, I stopped asking that. It's amazing how many people don't like history. I think a lot of that's because they didn't have good teachers in school. And it's interesting, as people get older, they get a new interest in their roots. A lot of my best students were middle-aged and beyond. It's amazing. Now today I'm going to be focusing on sort of setting up England and the Anglican Church for you to see what Wesley, what his setting was, as the Germans called it, his Sitzenleben. What was his setting in life? What was going on in the church? What was going on in his life? I'd like to take time at the end, if I had it, to do theology. I'm going to have to leave some of that for the next guys. Frankly, I haven't timed this lecture. I'm not sure how much time I'm going to need to fit everything in. I'll do a little bit of cutting and pasting. That's kind of risky. I know by experience where that can end up. But let's go ahead and get started this afternoon. I'm going to start with the Lutheran Reformation, 1517. And by the way, Paul did half of Wesley already this morning, his trip to Georgia and all of that. So if you heard that, that's part I can cut out a little bit. And there's some other things here that I think you're already going to be familiar with. Well, 1517, Luther nails his famous 95 Thesis to the church door at Wittenberg. Like a lot of great reformers, he didn't mean to start a reformation. It's not like he woke up one morning and said, well, I think I'll start a Reformation Day. It's like a good day to start it. It was just a process that was ongoing, and I want to tell you just a little bit about that church that he was breaking away from. Everybody talks about the Catholic Church. In those days, nobody called it the Catholic Church. It was the Church of the Empire. It was the Imperial Church. The Holy Roman Emperor wielded the sword for the Pope, and the Pope was, as he saw himself, the Vicar of Christ. He was Christ's emissary here on earth. The Pope saw himself as the bridge between heaven and earth. And for 1,000 years, the church had pretty well controlled what we call the Middle Ages. Now, historians always have a problem. They like to periodize everything. Something has to have a beginning and an ending. Basically, the Roman Empire fell, we say, in 476 AD. That's the last Western emperor that occupied the throne. So if we round that up to 500, and then we take his 95 Thesis in 1517, we basically could round off, say, from 500 to 1500. We got a millennium there of the control of the Catholic Church. Now keep in mind that this was a church controlled by priests on the local level. I want to remind you that illiteracy was running at 98%. Historians, social historians tell us only about 2% of the people could read or write, what few books there were. And so anytime you have that kind of ignorance and lack of knowledge, people are very superstitious. They'll believe anything the priest tells them. And so the Catholic Church controlled all the rites of passage. They baptized your baby when they were born. They gave them their catechism and their first communion. They married you. You had to get married in the church. They served you last rites when you were dying. They buried you in a consecrated cemetery, which is very important, because if you're buried in any other kind of a cemetery, you can forget about heaven. You'll be hung up forever in purgatory. And so they controlled you. As Augustine said at one point, outside the church, there is no salvation. The church controlled everything in society, and everything revolved around it. The Catholic Church, I'm going to use that term because that's what you're used to, of course, was a religion of works, and the priests controlled everything through the confessional booth. And we already heard this morning how Luther sought for some sort of relief spiritually, trying this and trying that, what he'd been taught, and nothing worked. Well, he had his evangelical breakthrough, and it's interesting, on the eve of his conversion, Luther had made his famous pilgrimage to Rome. Everybody wanted to go to Rome in those days, particularly if you're a monk. So if you can imagine, he walks from Wittenberg, Germany, all the way to Rome. And the closer he got to Rome, the more corrupt he sensed it was. He sees these poor peasants trying to pay for indulgences, praying their way up the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, and he came home thoroughly disgusted. And within about a year of that, he finally found Christ to be his Savior. Now, Luther is quite a prolific writer. Like I said, he didn't plan on starting a Reformation, but before long he finds himself with the news of justification by faith is spreading out throughout Germany. He's a prolific writer. If you want to buy the works of Luther, take along your banker. There's 85 volumes in the set. He liked to write, and his writings went all over Europe. Merchants hauled them across the English Channel. There was an interesting place in Cambridge called Little Germany, where all the scholars would get together upstairs of what was known as the White Horse Tavern. It wasn't a tavern as we think of it today, probably more like a hotel. And they would secretly read and discuss the writings of Luther and this idea of justification by faith. And so Lutheranism spread throughout Western Europe and over into England. Of course, he emphasized two things. In Latin, they call it sola fides. In other words, it's only by faith. And sola scriptura. No longer are we going to go by traditions. We're going to go by what the Bible says. And it's a whole new day dawning for Christianity. Now, we usually look at the Lutheran Reformation, and then by contrast, we look at the Swiss Reformation, and out of it came the Anabaptists. And we don't use the word denomination in those days. It's interesting. I have to tell my church history students, denomination is not an accurate word to use until after the American Revolution. And by the way, if you lived in Europe, you didn't get out the yellow pages and decide where you wanted to go to church. There only was one church. And that's hard for you and I to think about. Religious pluralism was unheard of. There was only one church, and everybody belonged to it. Well, I want to go to England and focus on the things that led up to the Anglican Church. Just a word or two about Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the fellow who was behind the English Reformation. Fact of the matter is, what he wanted to do was get a divorce, and he sent his Cardinal Wolsey to Rome to get him a divorce. Well, it turns out Wolsey finds out that the Holy Roman Emperor is the nephew of the woman that Henry's trying to divorce. So he realizes that's not going to work. So the Pope says, just go back to England and just stall for time. Tell him anything. Tell him we're researching. We'll get an answer. And you don't mess around with Henry VIII that way. You don't put him on hold. So finally, in 1543, he forces through Parliament the Act of Supremacy, where he says that the king is the only head of the church in England, the Church of England. Now, the prepositions are important. For 1,000 years, it had been the church in England, and in Germany, and in Denmark, and everywhere else. Now it becomes the Church of England, and we call it the Anglican Church. Fact of the matter is, not much changed. They had 7 sacraments at the beginning of the English Reformation. They still had 7 sacraments at the end of the English Reformation. Nothing changed. No preaching in the vernacular. No English Bibles. Basically, Henry lived and died a Catholic, but he called himself the head of the Anglican Church. The real Reformation comes under Edward VI, his son. Goes on the throne at the age of 9 and died at the age of 15. Had 2 co-regents that worked with him, and the real Protestant Reformation in England comes under Edward VI. It's interesting what Edward did. He puts together through his clergy what he called the Book of Common Prayer. And what the Catholic Church had done for 1,000 years was taught transubstantiation. Some of you know that term. For those of you who don't, it's essentially the idea that at communion service, with the cup and the bread there in front of them, when the priest says the magical words over it, and one of the choir boys rings the bell, you know at that very moment, that bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ. It's a trans-substance. It's a change of substance, and they believe that they're really, whether you know it or not, every time you go into a Catholic service, when they do a communion, they're re-crucifying Christ. They're re-offering him on the cross of the altar. And that is called the doctrine of the real presence. They really believe that turned into the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Now when Edward came along, and they're trying to get the Protestant Reformation through England, they have to do something with that. Now Luther, when he dealt with it, he gave up transubstantiation, and he instituted what was called consubstantiation. Actually, he probably didn't use the term, but all of his theologians since have used that term. And they say that since Christ is everywhere present, he must be present in the cup and in the bread. That's the Lutheran position today. Zwingli, the theologian over in Switzerland, he said there's nothing to any of it. It's just a memorial meal. In other words, nothing changes. Christ isn't present in any way, shape, or form. And so if I could put a continuum on the board here, on the one end we'd have the Catholic Church with transubstantiation. At the other end you've got this memorial meal of Zwingli. And then somewhere a little bit off of transubstantiation is Luther with his consubstantiation. Now watch where I'm going with this. Edward and his theologians, they decide that both of those are incorrect, but they've got to somehow sell this to the English people who love this idea of transubstantiation. So they put together a Book of Common Prayer that outlines all the services. Everybody all over England is going to be worshiping out of the same book. The priest is going to be reading out of the same material. And when it was time to do the communion, as he's passing out the elements, he's going to be translating that Latin word, hoc est corpus meum, which means this is my body. And as he does that, he passes it out, and he reads, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. And the Catholics all were happy with that. That still sounds like transubstantiation to them. However, they're ready for the next step. 3 years later, in 1552, they do a revised edition of the Book of Common Prayer. Now watch what happens when they do the communion. Now he says, take, eat, in remembrance that Christ died for you. Now here comes the memory part, the memorial meal. And he doesn't say anything about, this is my body, and the Catholics are outraged. Most of the Catholics are the wealthy people that live in the north part of England, and the poorest people down in the slums. They wanted to leave that transubstantiation thing alone. Well, Edward VI dies. They've allowed clergy to get married now. They made a lot of changes. They outlawed the confessional booth. They've dropped all the sacraments down to 2, just baptism and communion. And he dies at the age of 15. Not a happy fellow, a brilliant king. I'm interested in people's last words. You know what Edward VI said when he died? His last words were, Lord God, deliver me out of this miserable existence. He died of TB. He was not a happy fellow, but he seemed to have a relationship with God. Well, he's followed by Bloody Mary, as she's called. Truth be told, she probably didn't kill as many people as her dad did, but she gets the reputation because of a guy by the name of John Foxe, who wrote Foxe's Book of Martyrs. He sort of sensationalized what she had done. She tries to turn the clock back in England to the way it was when Henry died. She brings back transubstantiation, throws out the Book of Common Prayer, runs about 800 preachers out of the land, and they all go to Geneva and Germany, where they get even more Protestantized. And they'll be coming back a few years later, and England will become even more Protestant. It's interesting how that sort of backfired on her. So, Mary dies then, a short term on the throne, and then along comes Elizabeth. Elizabeth has a long tenure. Her people love her. She makes it all the way down to 1603 when her cousin James comes on the throne. Elizabeth introduces a Book of Common Prayer, a new revision, gets it through Parliament, does everything back the way her brother had left it now. And now when the priest passes out, watch what she did. Listen closely, because listen what happens in your church when you do communion. The priest now says, take, eat, this is my body. And as often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. And what she has done is she has combined the best of both worlds, you see. She's got both of it in there. Now, pay attention to your pastor. You can tell if he's a Zwinglian or if he's a Catholic or what he is by what he says. Somebody said, and I won't say any names or anything, I heard the other day when I took communion, it's interesting, I've had it just a couple of times recently, said, this represents the body of the Lord. I said, where in the world is this guy coming from? That's not in anybody's prayer book. It's not in our discipline. So it's the doctrine of the real presence. The fact of the matter is, where are we on that? Well, actually Calvin probably came the closest to where Wesley fell and right behind him. It's the idea that Christ is there, but he's there spiritually. His spiritual presence is there. We don't argue over the doctrine of the real presence. But these are some of the issues that were going on in the Anglican Church, and this is going to become an issue for Wesley when he finally starts organizing the Methodist Church. What's he going to do with communion, and who's going to serve it? When Elizabeth finally got through with the Elizabethan settlement, as we call it, in 1552, the Anglican Church was Episcopal in its polity, that is, in its organization. It was very Calvinistic in its theology. Forget the idea that they were Wesleyan Methodists in their theology. They weren't. They're very Calvinistic. And they were Lutheran in that they believed in justification by faith. So they're Episcopal in their form of church government. I'll explain that in a minute. They believe in justification by faith, and they're very Calvinistic in their theology. Let me say a word about an Episcopal form of government. There are three forms of government. I did a book review back a couple of months ago, one evening down here for the bookstore, and I was surprised how many people came up to me later and said they didn't know this thing about church government, so I'm going to share it with you. Just take a minute. In the Episcopal form of government, and I'm using small case letters now, forget the name of the church, this is a form of government. In the Episcopal form of government, the power flow is from the top down. You've got to have a bishop, an archbishop, or a pope, or something like that. And these people up here make all the decisions, they write all the rules, they decide everything's going to be done, and they just sort of send it down like a king through his realm and tells the little people what they're going to do. Now, if we had a continuum, we'd put that on the extreme right end. At the other end is another form of church government, and this is congregational, again, small c. I'm not talking about the congregational church, I'm talking about a type of church government. And this is where all the power resides at the local level. The people decide what they're going to do. They call their own preacher, they fire their own preacher, they don't take orders from anybody else, they write their own disciplines. That's a congregational form of government. Halfway in between is where most of us are. If you're Bible Methodists or whatever you represent today, I think most of you probably are what we call the Presbyterian. And again, I'm emphasizing it's a small case P. In a Presbyterian form of government, the local people elect representatives who go to some general assembly or a synod or whatever you want to call it, and they're a conference, maybe an annual conference, and there you make the rules, and you agree on them, and then they come down to the local people. It's interesting, the Anglican Church was very Episcopal. The word episcopius comes from the Greek word that we get our word bishop from. It's the bishop's form of government. The Free Methodist Church, when B.T. Roberts organized it, was an Episcopal form of government. When Asbury organized the American Methodists, it was called the Methodist Episcopal Church. When the Wesleyan Methodists formed, they wanted nothing to do with bishops, and so they went with the Presbyterian form of government. I think the Bible Methodists had that, and others. So, the Elizabethan settlement pretty well fixes things through the era of the Tudors, starting with Henry VII and ending with Elizabeth. Then came the reign of the Stuarts, James I. These are Scottish people. He was James V up in Scotland. He comes to England and joins the two countries together, rules over both of them as James I. He's the one that gives us the King James Bible in 1612. And then we have his son Charles. Things get bad. Civil War breaks out because Charles I is getting awfully comfortable with the Catholics again. If you lived in England in the middle of the 1600s, when I was a kid, if your mom and dad wanted to scare you, they said, "You be home the night before dark or the communists will get you." When I was a kid, there was a communist behind every tree. If you lived in England, there was a Catholic behind every tree. In fact, the Catholic Church actually set up seminaries in northern France to send missionaries back to England to try to take England back into the fold again. Some of them were caught, and they paid with their heads for trying that. So Catholicism was not a good word in England, and yet there were those who were secretly trying to bring it back. Charles I's wife, Henrietta, was very cozy with the Catholics. And eventually then he got into civil war with the English people. Oliver Cromwell leads the New Model Army. There was actually two different phases to that war, and at the end of that war, Charles I was put on trial and executed by his own people. And then Oliver Cromwell rules down to 1660. I want to mention one thing that happens during that English Civil War. The English bishops got together and met at Westminster Abbey and put together what's called the Westminster Confession of Faith. If you want to know what five-point Calvinism is, read the Westminster Confession of Faith. That's the touchstone of all Calvinism. And so if you have a Baptist friend and you ask him what you are, just ask him if he subscribes to the tenet of the Westminster Confession of Faith. You'll know you're dealing with a five-point Calvinist. So I'm stressing England was very Calvinistic at that point. The bishops put this document together. Now, the Stuarts continue all the way down to Anne. In 1715, Anne is the last of the Stuarts, so that's Stuart England. And now we go to Germany and we get the House of Hanover. We have George I, George II, who will be on the throne when Wesley comes alive, and then George III, who ruled a long time, from 1760 all the way down to 1820 through the American Revolutionary War, King George III. That's the House of Hanover. I'll just say a little bit about Wesley. Wesley himself is born to parents who both came from lines of dissenters. What is a dissenter? Well, in 1660, when the monarchy was restored, Oliver Cromwell had died. His son Richard tried it for a year and a half and couldn't do it. And so Parliament, now they send across the waters for a daughter of Charles, it's James's daughter, and a guy named William, and that's William and Mary. They come on the throne as co-emperors, you may say, co-kings. And here's interesting. The divine right of monarchy ends at this point, because what they said is, Parliament says, here's the rules, will you accept it? And William and Mary said they would, so they come to England and start as king and queen. Now the point is, the hand that gives you the crown is the hand that can take the crown. So this begins what's called a constitutional monarchy in England, and that's what Wesley's going to be living under. In 1662, Parliament passed what was called the 3 Mile Act. That is, if you won't take an oath of allegiance to the king, and by default to the Church of England, then if you're going to be a preacher, you can't come within 3 miles of any Anglican church, which is kind of hard to deal with because they're scattered all over the countryside. That's called the 3 Mile Act. Susanna Wesley came from a family whose her father was a dissenter preacher. In other words, he's a renegade. He's outside the realm. He's a free thinker. That tradition was also in Wesley's father, Samuel, although Samuel came back into the church and was an ordained Anglican clergy in Epworth when Wesley was born. Now we hear a lot about this great family of 19 children. Most of those didn't survive infancy. There were probably about 8 or 9 that made it all the way into adulthood. Wesley was way at the end of the litter. His nickname was Jackie, and his mother, of course, is, everybody knows about Susanna Wesley and how she ran the house. At the age of 10, he is sent from Epworth. Now, this is the boy who was rescued from the burning parsonage. Well, I beg your pardon, you don't call them parsonages. That was in the rectory. He was in the rectory that caught on fire. Thatched roof caught on fire. We almost lost the Father Methodism when he was just a baby. But they rescued him. At the age of 10, he is in Charterhouse in London, preparing for Oxford, where he goes. In 1825, he is now finished at Oxford and is offered a teaching position. It's called a fellowship at Lincoln College, and it's there where he starts getting serious about spiritual matters. The Holy Club is organized. Wesley joined up with a group who were already meeting, but he's just got a knack for organizing things. And before long, he and Charles are pretty well running the thing. And you all know everybody knows the story of the Holy Club. You've all heard illustrations from it. He links up with George Whitefield while he's there, and just can't get peace for his soul. A few years later, he's ordained an Anglican priest. Trying this, trying that, like Luther, just can't find Christ in saving faith. And finally, he and Charles decide that they're going to do the ultimate sacrificed. They've been fasting. They've been working with the poor and the peasants and visiting those in jail, trying to, like Luther, work their way to salvation. And in 1733, the last colony in America is organized, the great colony of Georgia. And Governor Oglethorpe asks Charles to go along as his secretary. And so Charles tells John about it, and John decides he'll pay the ultimate price, and the two of them head off for Georgia, where he's going to, as he said, convert the Indians, the Native Americans. The sad part is when he leaves and gets back home, he said, I went to convert them, but he said, oh, who will convert me? So he goes to the mission field for, about 2.5 years. Charles lasted all of 6 months and was ill. Wesley stays there. I don't want to spend a lot of time about him and his love life. If you want to read about Charles and Miss Sophie, well, I'll just say this about Miss Hobe. People suggested Wesley ought to get married, but he was afraid a woman might turn him out of the pathway of duty. May I repeat that for students in the classroom? He was afraid he would get his eyes off the ball, so he always gets counsel from his friends, particularly if Charles is available, what shall I do? And they decided maybe he'd do well to wait a while. In the meantime, he's spending quality time with Miss Sophia Hobe, who is the niece of one of the power brokers in Savannah, Georgia, and he actually gets quite familiar with her. He teaches her Christian ethics, and he teaches her, what was the other language? French? I think he was teaching her for German. One of the other. He was teaching her, was it French? Yes, he's... Comment allez-vous? Yes, he's teaching her French. In the meantime, he's getting wound in himself. He has pretty strong attachment. And to make a long story short, she thinks he's proposing. He's not sure what he's doing. And they sort of on again, off again. At the last minute, she marries the other guy. So Wesley then, on a technicality, decides not to serve her communion when she comes forward. There's no get-even spirit at all, I'm sure, because on a technicality, you're supposed to notify the priest if you're going to take communion. And she hadn't done it, so he's got her on a little... But they actually were outraged. Her uncle and others demanded charges against him. There was a bill of indictment. He actually responds 6 times to this inquisition. And about the time they're ready to take the thing to the level of trial, Wesley decides the Lord would have him go back to England. So one Christmas Eve or somewhere around there, while everybody else is partying, Wesley gets a rowboat, he heads out in the harbor, and he bids goodbye to America. Of course, he's met these pietists on the way. They're called Moravians. I want to say a little bit about some of the streams that flow into Wesley's thinking. Who is this John Wesley? What makes him more than the typical Anglican priest? There's more going on here than just a praying mother. Well, Luther had made an enormous step in breaking with the Catholic Church, and he actually forms then the Lutheran Church. For about 100 years, the Lutherans existed, but they were sterile and hybrid and given to a lot of form and not much life in their services, pretty sterile. And after about 100 years up in Germany, a couple of, particularly a young man by the name of Spener, says, you know, there's more to religion than this, than just grinding out a liturgy, a ritual. And he seems to already have a relationship with God, Philip Spener, and he begins to form what he calls in Latin Collegia Pietites, which means a college of pietists. It doesn't amount to much more than what we used to have when I was a kid, a cottage prayer meeting. Anybody ever know what a cottage prayer meeting is? Where they get together, study the Bible, and pray. And all of a sudden, it's like a fire gets kindled up in that part of Germany. And these pietists are Lutherans who had a religious awakening, and out of them come the Moravians. This is the group that was referred to this morning in the service. They were traveling, there were a lot of Moravians down in Georgia where the Wesley brothers were heading, and he meets several of them and has ongoing dialogue with them in Georgia, and they are able to help him understand a lot more about evangelical faith and what God can really do for you. So the pietists are important to him. In fact, I'm going to come back to them in a little bit. There's another group that's going to affect Wesley because while he's an Oxford Don, he's doing a lot of reading. He's reading people like Jeremy Taylor and William Law, and these are devotional writers, theologians, Serious Call, and Holy Living and Holy Dying, things like that is what Wesley is feeding himself on. And he comes across the writings of some of the mystics. There's a mystical side to Wesley. Now, what is a mystic, anyhow? Heard people say, oh, don't go down that road, it's too mystical for me. What is mysticism? Actually, there were some very excellent Catholic mystics. Bishop Fenelon, Madame Guyon, and others. What are mystics after? They've been around all through the Middle Ages. In fact, they existed in Judaism as well. I remember I had a medieval course in Judaism where we talked about the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. He said, I don't need synagogues, I don't need scrolls, I don't need Talmuds, I just go out in the woods and I just contemplate and I meet God out there. And what they're all seeking is basically summed up as a momentary union with God. Very, very spiritual. They don't need prayer books, they don't need scrolls, and a lot of times mystics get a bad name. Truth of the matter is, and Wesley will tell you, any true religion's got some mysticism in it. I'll tell you what, when I'm in camp meeting on Sunday morning, and the choir is singing Arise, My Soul Arise, and the congregation joins in, I start feeling a little bit mystical. That thing that just sort of elevates your emotions toward God. Takes you out of that sterile, hybrid, non-relationship where you're just going by the books. And there's something to mysticism, and there's certainly going to be some of that in Wesley. He's also influenced by the Eastern Orthodox fathers. When I teach at Ashland Seminary, the chairman of my department, Lou Kiefer, wrote his doctoral dissertation at Temple University on Wesley's being influenced by the Eastern Orthodox fathers. St. John of Damascus and Gregory of Nyssa, some of these people. Wesley was very much into that. And Dr. Kiefer does a good job of showing how that influences his thinking. Let me mention a little bit about the Eastern Orthodox. I have a good friend that I take to my history class and let him give one lecture per semester. I usually take him to the seminary at Ashland. A couple of times I've taken him to AWC when I was living up there. And I just saw a young lady, well, she's a middle-aged woman now. My students are middle-aged now. And I said, do you remember that class when I had Father Tillman? Yeah, she said, I did. Well, I said, well, I remember what you wrote. I said, after I bring a visitor in, I ask you to write a little paragraph, sort of a response, what you thought about the guy. And she said, wow, she said, he was really interesting. Better not have him too often. He's too convincing. So I remembered that. I would meet Father Tillman at McDonald's, and we'd drive about an hour to the seminary. And I said, Father Tillman, now here's his story. He was training to be an Episcopal priest. Back when I was a boy, Bishop Spong was a liberal bishop, and he was advocating for ordination of homosexuals. And young David Tillman from Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, is down in Tennessee at a very prestigious school called Sewanee University of the South. You can train for the Anglican ministry there. And he said, if that's the way the Anglicans are going, I'm out of here. So he looks for something to join, and he lands in with the Eastern Orthodox. So I went down to his church one day. He was actually pioneering what was actually more of a Russian Orthodox church there in Canton, Ohio. And I said, well, tell me how you do a confessional. I said, you know you can't forgive sins. That belongs to God. Oh, he said, you misunderstand. I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, here comes a man. He said, it's noontime. He's on his lunch break. He comes down to our church there, and he kneels down in front of the candles there in the center of the main aisle. He crosses himself, and he says a prayer, and then he goes up to this other place and kneels. And then he looks up at me, and I ask him, what do you need to confess? And he'll tell him whatever's on his mind. Only two people in the building. I said, well, you can't forgive sin. He said, well, I know that. He said, I don't forgive sin. Now, here was the revelation for me. He said, I'm just following James chapter 5. It says you're supposed to confess your faults, your sins to one another. And he said, we happen to have the idea that no man is forgiven, no person is forgiven. Even though God may forgive them, they still have to confess it to another man. Well, see, Wesley would be aware of that. And I think once he starts organizing his church after his Aldersgate experience, he starts with these classes and these bands and the societies. And these little intimate groups of 10 or 12 people where you need a ticket to get in, that's a lot of what Wesley's having these class leaders do. I wonder if any of you have ever been to a real, honest-to-goodness class meeting. We went to our old pastor one time and said, we want a class meeting. Saturday night, about 8 of us met with old Brother McPherson in the Salem Church. Just a couple lights on in there, it's kind of dim. And he starts asking us questions about how we're doing. Man, about halfway through that, we're starting to shift around in our seats, and I said, man, that's not what we thought class meeting was all about. We thought we were going to study the Bible and sing and pray. Well, the point is, this Eastern Orthodox idea is kind of an accountability thing. And I think maybe there's more. Someday I'll have one of my students preach a good sermon out of James 5. I think there's something in there, this idea of confessing your faults one to another. I think it's kind of a modern day accountability. And I think Wesley hit it a few hundred years ahead of the rest of us, but I think he was onto something. Because I'll tell you what, those class meetings is what made Methodism as powerful as it was. They would dig a person out. They wouldn't let you be comfortable in your life of deadness and dryness. They just keep hoeing around your roots till you either got in or got out. The class meetings, the bands, and the societies. What Wesley did, essentially, is this. In the apostolic period, it wasn't long after Pentecost, within a generation or two, the early church fathers talked about perfection, and they talked about sanctification, and while we understand them as talking about the same essential thing, sanctification and perfection started getting separated early in the apostolic father period. And it got farther and farther apart all through the Middle Ages. Once in a while you'd find some monk, even one Pope, Gregory. These fellows understood what was going on with this business of perfection and sanctification. Let me say something to you. Sanctification is purification of your heart. Perfection is that which directs you to live a holy life. And it wasn't long going toward the Middle Ages to where the church got the idea that you couldn't live a holy life. You could always try. Perfection was always out there. It was like a carrot on the stick. Someday I want to be perfect. I hope to get there. I'm trying my best. It sounds like today when I talk to my Mennonite friends. They're godly people living a godly life, but for them perfection's always out down the road somewhere. It's like they keep kicking the can down the road. They never quite get there. And that's what happened to perfection all through the Middle Ages. Even Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, started to bring them closer together. But essentially what was going on in the Catholic Church and in the Lutheran Church and in the Presbyterian Church was the idea that you baptize an infant, and that's his sanctification. And that's supposed to deal with original sin. Perfection is something you always talk about in the sweet by and by, but you never get there. And Wesley's genius was, with God helping him, he saw these two really belong together. The idea was people were afraid of this word perfection because in their mind they're thinking absolute perfection, which belongs to God alone. Or maybe angelic perfection, or at the very least what Adam had before he fell. And Wesley says it's none of that, it's Christian perfection. And so Wesley brings together the concept of perfection and sanctification. And that really becomes the backbone of his message. Now, do a little cutting and pasting here. What do I got, about 15 minutes? Where's Paul? Did he desert me? Okay, am I doing all right, Paul? Let's say a little bit about how he organized his bands. I'll take that to the next step, and then we'll go back and spend the rest of our time on his theology. I could spend a lot of time there, but some of you look like your carbs are kicking in already. Fall over and break your neck, we don't have insurance to cover you. I knew this was going to happen. I love after lunch services. I don't care about teaching and preaching. I love 1 o'clock classes at the college. Westminster Confession of Faith, as I said, teaches, first of all, their starting point is total depravity. The confession says that everybody who is born with their back toward God and their face toward eternal destruction. Interestingly enough, Arminius agreed with that, and so did Wesley. The problem is, these guys factor in prevenient grace. So we're not totally deprived or totally depraved as long as God is in the equation. His Holy Spirit is in the world. If you think you've seen a bad world out there, friend, you've never seen this world without the Holy Spirit in it. The Holy Spirit restrains and holds back the awfulness of sin. And it's prevenient grace that enables you. I tell my theology students, when Christ was hanging on the cross, as his life's blood is ebbing away, in that blood there were several benefits that accrue to you and me. I'll just summarize the first three. I won't get too deep here. First of all, babies get a free pass to heaven. Because of Jesus' blood at Calvary, all infants get to go to heaven. We believe in total depravity, but we have prevenient grace, and in the benefits of the atonement, babies get a free pass. Secondly, follows on the heels of that, anyone who is born without mental capabilities of making moral decisions, they get a free pass to heaven. But the other one that I want to talk about that Wesley emphasizes is in that benefit of the atonement, it enables the Spirit to hear the call of God when he starts talking to you. It enables you to hear, and it enables you to respond. Unfortunately, Whitefield, who was part of that holy club, said that that was not the case. He said he was very much a five-pointer, and he and Wesley frequently would have discussions about this. I thought I had something with me. I think that's on that other page that I didn't bring along. Wesley and Whitefield parted company. They always had respect for each other. In fact, most of you know that famous line at the end. They said, Wesley, do you expect to see Whitefield in heaven? And now I said, I really don't. He said, he'll be too near the throne. Well, that's a nice way to talk about your theological opponent, because he knew Whitefield was living far above his theology. But I found a letter where Wesley writes to Whitefield, and he said, Mr. Whitefield, he said, I've talked to God about this predestination thing, and he says, God has shown me that I'm right and you are wrong. Affectionately yours, J. Wesley. Well, Whitefield responds, and he says, Mr. Wesley said, I've talked to the Lord about this business of predestination, and he said, God has shown me that I'm right and you're wrong. Affectionately yours, G. Whitefield. But they managed somehow to have an ongoing relationship outside their theological differences. Now, 1760, of course, they're getting organized. 1745, 1744, they had their first conference in England. And Wesley, of course, is traveling all over England, Wales, Scotland. Wesley himself never came to America. Whitefield came 7 times. He died on his 7th trip over here. A powerful preacher. It was Whitefield who introduced Wesley into what was called field preaching. Because what happened is Wesley continued to preach his evangelical message of deliverance from sin. One by one, the bishops were shutting off their churches to him. Now, he still continues as a card-carrying Anglican priest till the day he dies. But he's not allowed to preach in the churches. The bishops are turning him away. They had already turned Whitefield away. So Whitefield says, well, we'll go outside and preach. Now, when I say field preaching, you're thinking of a hayfield or something like that, a cornfield. No, it doesn't mean that. It just simply means out of doors. It could be on the courthouse steps. In Wesley's case, when he finally tries it and he's up in Epworth, he gets up on his father's tombstone. That'd be quite a pulpit, wouldn't it? Standing on his dad's tombstone, preaching, field preaching. It led to a lot of problems. Wesley, right after his conversion, I want to say this, as soon as the Aldersgate experience is over in May of '38, by June, he's heading over to where these Moravians are. He wants to get back in contact with them. Peter Bowler is the fellow who was responsible for him being in Aldersgate. He was a good mentor while Wesley was in London, but he wanted to find the source. It's interesting, if you read his diaries, he walked all the way to southern Germany. Can you imagine that? He takes a boat across the English Channel, walks across France, Belgium, crosses the Rhine River, came to some Catholic cities where they wouldn't even let him in for the night. He has to sleep outside. There's that kind of strong Catholic influence in Europe. And finally he gets to Herrnhut, where Count Zinzendorf has provided these towns for the Moravians. And he loves the Moravians. He kind of owes his spiritual life to them, but he doesn't agree with them, because they had this idea that when you get saved, you have everything you need. He would sit down and talk to Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf said, if you have grace, you have all grace. It's all you need. The task is done. Just keep walking with the Lord and everything will be okay. And Wesley and the Moravians finally parted ways. The foundry was actually their building, and he was meeting with Methodists in the foundry. There came a day where he pulled out, and they built City Road Chapel, start their own church there in London, just because he realized that these people were not into Christian perfection as the Bible taught it. In the 1760s, Wesley started sending missionaries to America. People like Pillmore and Boardman and others. Now there are a few societies already very loosely organized in New York City. Captain Webb is here, old military officer with a patch over one eye. Philip Embry and his cousin Barbara Heck, they're meeting in New York City. Webb is down in Philadelphia. Baltimore, these become centers of Methodism. And Wesley's got to do something, because he finds out outside Frederick, Maryland, William Strawbridge is serving communion, and he's not ordained in anything. He's just a layman doing communion. Wesley can't abide that. So now he faces the same problem that Luther faced. You don't have a denomination, we don't use that name, but in effect that's what he's got here. How are you going to get a man ordained? Can you ordain him yourself? Luther didn't want to do it. I remember sitting in class in the Gettysburg Seminary with the Lutherans, and Luther agonized over this. People need the communion. What are we going to do, send them back to the Catholic Church? So he finally, and the big issue is apostolic succession. Maybe I'm ordained as a priest, but I'm not consecrated as a bishop. But Luther took that step, and he starts ordaining preachers. And Wesley decides he's got to do the same thing. Now the interesting thing is, Methodism was never meant to compete with the Anglican Church. It was what we would call today in our vernacular a parachurch movement. He wants it to go alongside the Anglican Church. In fact, they never scheduled Methodist services at the same time as the Anglicans were meeting, because he wanted to meet with the Methodists, and then they could get down the street and get their communion down at the Anglican Church. And so he doesn't mean to compete with them. He's trying to augment what they're doing. But now we got Methodists over in America who are serving the communion as laymen. So what Wesley does then is he selects, he knows Francis Asbury is a popular preacher in America. He knows him well. He calls him Frankie. And he finally decides he's got to take the step. He's dealing with his apostolic succession thing the same as Luther did. So he calls in Dr. Thomas Coke, and he ordains him as a priest in this Methodist church, and gives him directions to go over to America, which Coke does. At the Christmas conference, he meets Asbury, and then he confers the same right onto Asbury. Now, he doesn't want them to, he wants them to be called superintendents. If you're going to call them anything, call them superintendents. Whatever you do, don't call him a bishop. Here's the letter. He said, he found out later that Asbury had allowed the people to call him bishop. This is what the American Methodists wanted. And he said, there is indeed a wide difference between the relation wherein you stand to the Americans and the relation where I stand to all Methodists. He said, you are the elder brother of the American Methodists. I am under God the father of the whole family. It's kind of a benevolent dictator, isn't it? No question who's in charge. And he said, therefore I naturally care for you all in a manner no other person can do. Therefore I, in a measure, provided for you all. For the supplies which Dr. Coke provides for you, he could not provide were it not for me, were it not that I not only permit him to collect, but also support him in doing so. But then he goes on and he says, one instance of this pretentiousness on your side has given me great concern, Wesley says. I'll read this. How dare you suffer yourself to be called a bishop? He said, bishops have been nothing but grief to me. We don't want bishops. And now you're allowing them to call you a bishop. He said, I shudder. I start at the very thought. Why, men may call me a knave, or a fool, a rascal, a scoundrel, and I am content. But they shall never, by my consent, call me a bishop. For my sake, for God's sake, for Christ's sake, put a full end to this. Let the Presbyterians do what they please, but let the Methodists know their calling better. I said, put that bishop thing on the shelf. Well, he didn't do it. And it continues on in the Methodist Church to this day. Well, it got worse, though. Not only was Asbury the clear choice of the Americans, Coke was back and forth. He was in England, he's in America, he's not sure where he wants to do. He loves missions, he dies halfway around the world on a missionary voyage. But at one time, the American Methodists decide to build a college. Near Aberdeen, Maryland, they build this college, and it's named Cokesbury. Okay? Thomas Coke, Francis Asbury. Wesley finds out about it. Oh, he said, but in one point, my dear brother, I am a little afraid. Both the doctor and you differ from me. I study to be little. You study to be great. I creep. You strut along. I found a school. You a college. Nay, and call it after your own names. Oh, beware. Do not seek to be something. Let me be nothing, and Christ be all in all. Well, the college burned down a few years later after Wesley died. Had he been alive, I can only imagine the epitaph he'd have for that college. And they rebuilt it, and it burned down a few more years later, and they just left it alone. I guess there's maybe still some ashes around Aberdeen, Maryland. I don't know. Well, I think the time is probably far enough gone that I better not start into his theology. Wesley was very big on the gradual side of entire sanctification. In fact, he wrote a letter to his brother one time. Charles, he said, I want you to press the instantaneous aspect of holiness. And he said, and that'll free me up to press the gradual. Now, I've been studying theology for a long time and teaching it for a little while. And I've noticed we get all of our theology from the Nazarenes. Go to any holiness preacher's library and you'll find a slew of Nazarene theologians there. What the Nazarenes have done, particularly since the days of Richard S. Taylor and Perkheiser, later Nazarenes, here's what they've done. They've made it more and more instantaneous and less gradual until it doesn't exist anymore. They've sort of gradualized it out of existence. Now, you need a theology class. Let me explain that to you. But the point of the matter is, there's this gradual growth toward it, but there's an instantaneous moment when he does the work, and then you're freed up to really grow afterwards. And there are 2 or 3 theologians among the Nazarenes that have watered this thing down and watered it down, won't call their names. They've taken sin now. Sin is just a relational thing. There's nothing absolute about sin. What might be sin for you isn't sin for me. And you see where they're going. And I know where it's going to end up. So he said, Charles, he said, you're good at that. You go press the instantaneous, and I'll press the gradual. I'll close with one other little thing. Charles did not like Wesley ordaining Coke and Asbury. He thought they had no business getting into this. And so these guys, when they want to make a message to each other, they always write a poem. Dr. McElwain, you probably know this one. On ordination that Charles strongly opposes, when he finds out what he's done, he says, so easily are bishops made by man's or woman's whim. Wesley his hands on Coke hath laid, but who hath laid hands on him? Charles is still struggling with that apostolic succession thing. He went to the grave feeling that way. All right, I think I'm going to stop for there, and I'm going to count on the other 3 lecturers filling all the gaps and voids that I have. Do you have any questions? We've got a couple of minutes here left. We lost a few minutes at the outset getting everybody seated, and I'm very selfish. I don't want to give up any minutes, so I'll take a few questions. If anybody wants to ask me anything, I'll tell you what I tell my students. You can ask any question and I'll answer it as long as I can say I don't know once in a while. Try not to say it too often. Yes?
Didn't Wesley somewhat separate the issue of the filling of the Spirit and entire sanctification, whereas later holiness writers have combined those two?
Yes, it starts with Fletcher. Fletcher does a lot more with Pentecost than Wesley does. I had that in my notes here, but I didn't know if I had time to get into that. Wesley is what we would say very Christological. He focuses on Christ in his messages. Fletcher takes it a step further. He develops dispensations. He's kind of the beginning of dispensational writers. Not in eschatology per se, but in this idea of the dispensation of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. That's more Fletcher. And Fletcher is very pneumatological in his orientation. He focuses on the Spirit, whereas Wesley focuses more on Christ. You've got to know the language of Wesley. I'll tell you what happened to me. You don't find Wesley using the book of Acts all that much. He uses it for illustrations, but he doesn't get his doctrines out of Acts. He gets them out of the epistles for the reasons that I'm suggesting right now. I remember I was in my first pastorate. My uncle and aunt had bought me a copy of Wesley's translation of the New Testament and the explanatory notes. So being a dutiful nephew, here I am about 3 weeks into my first pastorate. So I started reading my explanatory notes, and I came to the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, and I read the explanatory notes. And it didn't sound like what I'd been taught. So I called up the conference president, and some of you may have heard the name H.C. Van Wormer. Oh, I said, Brother Van Wormer, I said, where was the Apostle Paul converted? Oh, I said, on the road to Damascus. I said, well, let me read you what Wesley says. Wesley says he was 3 days and 3 nights in the pangs of the new birth. And I'll never forget Brother Van Wormer's answer. He said, well, there you are. That's why he was conference president. He knew how to answer those questions. Well, it's taken me a half a lifetime to figure out. Wesley uses a lot of 18th century metaphors and references that you and I, if you don't study these guys, you don't get a handle on what they're saying. When you're saved and justified, Wesley would say you're born again. When you're entirely sanctified, you're fully born. Well, you don't hear that kind of language in the pulpits today, but that's very common with Wesley. And once you understand that, you can understand what he's saying in those explanatory notes. And so it goes. I don't know if that helps or not. Yes?
I've got a question. In my experience, I've encountered people that were part of the holiness movement that were avid followers of Wesley and read avidly after him. And they were always seeking for holiness, but they never got there. Had some, well, they were neighboring people where I was laboring.
Yes.
And it created some uneasiness in my situation. Would that idea of Wesley's advocating, the growth, the development process, and leaving the rest to Charles as far as would that grow out of that type of idea?
Oh, that's all part of that. That's part of that same spiritual mix. Yes, I think if I were a pastor today, again, it's easy to talk to guys in college and tell them how to do it when I'm safely behind a desk where I can stay out of harm's way. But if I were a pastor, the focus is you get people saved. You have to show them the depths of depravity and show them that entire sanctification is not only a privilege, it's a duty. We don't press people to seek it. And that's the danger of what the Nazarenes did. You start kicking the can down the road and you never do get there. And you start losing your focus on it, you start losing your interest in it. And if there aren't a few saints in the church testifying to it and showing what it can do and living it, it'll dry up, it'll fall by the wayside. Once you see, I remember I was in Bible college. I remember one Sunday morning sitting there with one of my daughters on my lap halfway through the message. Thought I was sanctified, professing everything that was out there. And God began to pull back the curtain that morning, halfway through that sermon, and showed me what was left. And you didn't have to encourage me, just get out of my way, I'm seeking. I wanted deliverance from that. You've got to show people what their need is. And it's up to the pastor not only to encourage them, but to show them it's a duty to seek it until you get it.